Welcome to the Matt Cuda Photography Podcast, a podcast about nature and wildlife photography in your own backyard and throughout the United States. And welcome back to the podcast. This is episode 15, lens selection. But before we get into lens selection, I wanted to just back up to recap last week, and I want to kind of finish up what I was talking about last week because there's a little more to understand about exposure, even from a beginner's perspective. So we talked a lot about shutter speed and how to control your shutter to take wildlife images. And I still stand by what I said. Shutter speed is extremely, extremely important. It's probably the most important thing as a beginning wildlife photographer to understand, because unless you can get your shutter speed to the right setting, you're going to be very disappointed. So I want to talk about shutter speed, and I want to bring ISO into the picture here, because ISO is what you go to when you need more shutter speed. That may sound silly to you at first, but what I mean is this. If I am photographing at, say 7 o'clock in the morning, I'm kind of in a wooded area, and let's just say, for whatever reason, I don't have my tripod with me. I left my tripod at home, or maybe I'm just driving around in my car that day and just looking for opportunities to photograph. Well, in order to handhold my lens, I'm really going to need a fairly high shutter speed. Let's say, if I'm shooting with let's just say a 500 millimeter lens, and I'm hand holding it without vibration compensation or image stabilization, I'm going to have a shutter speed of 1/1000th of a second or greater, because when I'm shooting with my 7D, that's going to be out there at 900 and some millimeters. So I need to be thinking about 1/1000th of a second here, especially as a beginner, because I haven't learned how to hold the lens properly yet. I'm going to get a lot of camera shake, and I need to be thinking about that. So how do I get that 1/1000th of a second shutter speed? Because early in the morning, I'm going to be shooting, let's just say at 400 ISO, and it gives me, let's just say my exposure is 400 ISO, 1/250th of a second at f5. Okay, let's just say that's my exposure. Well, to hand hold that, it's going to be very difficult for you to get the right shot, or to get a good shot, I should say. So what I recommend doing is bumping up your ISO. Okay, now you got to be careful with that, because some cameras are notoriously bad at higher ISOs. For example, my Canon 7D is notoriously bad at ISOs over 800 ISO. And so you got to be careful, but it's kind of a game. You're always playing this game of trying to get the right shutter speed for what you're shooting and keep your ISO as low as possible. Because, like I said, as we increase that ISO, then the noise in our images becomes very apparent, and that may not be desirable. So what you want to do in this situation, we're at 2/50th of a second, and you're like, well, I need to get to 1/1000th of a second, so what do I need to do? In this case, I would need to increase my ISO from 400 to 1600. Now, 1600 is about as far as I like to go with a crop sensor camera in general. I've heard some of the new Sonys, you can go up higher than that, but with a crop sensor, I don't like to go above 1600. And so that gives me 1/1000th of a second at f5. I'm good to go. I can hand hold that shot. Now, these are all just general rules here. There's so many scenarios out there where I would not do what I just told you to do. For example, if I had image stabilization and my subject was still or motionless, if it was a bird perch, for example, I might get away with. I've shot my 150 to 600 at 600 as low as 1/125th of a second. You can do various things, but as a beginner, I recommend keeping that shutter speed high and then pushing your ISO, up to around 1600 if you have to. Keep it as low as possible, though. Maybe you can get away with an 800th of a second, or at ISO 800. Great. If you can get away with ISO 100, even better. So you see what I'm saying? There's always this battle between shutter and an ISO. Anyway, I don't want to talk about the ISO anymore. You just have to understand that ISO controls your light sensitivity, and there are times where you have to bump it. Now, what is better is if you actually learn good hand-holding techniques for your lenses, and you learn how to stabilize that lens against your face and tuck your elbows in and so forth, so that you can get the better shoot with lower shutter speeds. And that way you can have a more desirable image quality because you're using a lower ISO. I may have muddied the water there a little bit, but I wanted to at least address it slightly in this episode. The other thing I want to just slightly address at this point is aperture. We kind of left that out on the last episode. We talked about it, but it wasn't a high priority. But aperture, again, simply controls the quantity of the light and controls the depth of field. Okay, so what do I mean by depth of field? That's kind of an odd sounding thing, right? As a beginner, what's depth of field? It's very nebulous. Depth of field is simply the area of your image which is in focus. So if I'm focusing on a bear, for example, and he's 30 yards away, generally, you're going to have this, your bear is going to be mostly in focus, probably, and then slowly the background is going to go more and more and more out of focus. And your depth of field is much more shallow. A shallow depth of field shows a blurry background and even a blurry foreground oftentimes. For example, if I'm shooting a songbird, oftentimes I'll have maybe a quarter of an inch, if I'm lucky, of the bird in focus. So I just want to mention depth of field because that's important. And how does that correlate with your aperture? Well, if you're wide open, in other words, if you had an f4 lens and you're shooting it at f4, your depth of field is going to be much more shallow. So you're going to have less in focus than if you were shooting at, say, f11. And the reason for this is a lot of mathematical stuff that has to do with optics and so on. All you need to know for now is when I have my lens wide open, I have a very shallow depth of field, meaning not as much of my subject is in focus. If I have a higher f-stop number, say f11, f16, much more of my subject is going to be in focus. That's a very complex subject. We're just scratching the surface here. I mean, there are books written on just this topic. There are books written just on exposure and aperture and depth of field and lens selection. So, you're not going to get everything in this podcast, but hopefully it will kind of whet your appetite so you can go out and do a little more research. I'm just giving you hard, fast rules on how to use these various tools. And now you kind of see, as a beginner, now you're kind of seeing why I didn't go down this road, because it starts getting much more into controlling the composition of your image, if you will. I mean, we're actually using that aperture to create a great amount of the image in focus or a lot less of the image in focus. For example, if I was photographing a bird, okay, just a bird perched, it could be any bird, and in the background is all these little sticks and twigs and so forth. That's a very common scenario, right? Well, if I shoot that thing wide open at, say, f2.8 or f4, I'm going to have a very shallow depth of field. Now, that's going to be desirable in this case because I want that background to be a smooth, silky-looking background. Why? Because that's when I throw that background out of focus. When I shoot at f4 or f2.8 and I throw that background out of focus, first I've made my subject really pop. I've separated him from the background. I've gotten rid of all those distractions like those twigs and so forth. Now they're just a blurry you know, really a blurry, not mess, but just no longer visible. They're just faded into the background, if you will. And that's a very important concept in portrait photography and in wildlife photography in general. We're trying to simplify our image as much as we can. And so we're going to shoot with wide apertures when possible. Now, there are exceptions to that rule. I'm going to get into that later when we talk about lens selection. But for now, that's it on exposure. I don't want to talk about it anymore. Please go out there. There's great books written on exposure, how to make great images, how to use exposure to have various creative effects and so on. So go check those out. I think Brian Peterson wrote a very popular book called Understanding Exposure, and I recommend that book. And there's many, many more. Or please feel free to email me any questions on exposure, and I'll be more than happy to give you the best answer I can. Okay, on to lens selection, a little more interesting topic. Lens selection is not as complicated in wildlife photography as people, I think, want to make it out to be. Primarily in wildlife photography, we're looking at three types of lenses. We're looking at a short telephoto. That's, in my mind, that's any lens from, say, 60 millimeters or 85 millimeters out to, say, 180 millimeters. So that's a short telephoto to me. A medium telephoto, 200 to 300 millimeters, thereabouts. I've heard some people say 180 to 300, 180 to 400. It doesn't really matter. It's somewhere in between the short telephoto and the really long telephoto. Now, the long telephotos and super telephotos is the third category, and their lens is anywhere from 400 to 800 millimeters and even 1,000 millimeters. Canon used to make a 1,000 millimeter lens. There's a rumor out there right now that they're making a 1,000 millimeter DO lens. So, yeah, pretty impressive. No one can afford it, but I'm sure, but it's an impressive lens nonetheless. So three types of lenses. There's all these lenses, and they cost all this money, and you want to spend your money the best way you can. You want to get the best glass that you can for the money, and you don't want to waste your money, right? So what's the right lens for the job? What's the right lens for wildlife photography? You get this kind of question a lot as wildlife photographers, What lens should I buy? What camera should I buy? Well, the answer is, it depends. And why does it depend? Well, it depends on what you're shooting. It depends on your subjects that you're shooting regularly. It depends on what kind of lighting conditions you're shooting in regularly. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to list out some common subjects in the wildlife photography world. And I'm going to just give some basic recommendations for lens selection. Okay, first thing, songbirds. Songbirds. Wild songbirds with no blind. In other words, you're out walking through the woods and trying to be quiet and, maybe sitting at a base of a tree or kind of kneeling down on one knee, but no blind. No, you're not hidden anywhere. Okay, you're going to need, for this, you're really going to need a lens. Okay, honestly. If you're going to do that, you're going to need a 600 to 800 millimeter lens. You're going to need probably a 1.4x teleconverter and a 2x teleconverter. And you're going to probably want to shoot at around f8. Now, why do I say that? And what's that got to do with lens selection? Well, it does actually have a lot to do with it. Songbirds are so small, and you have to get so physically close to them that your depth of field is going to be very, very shallow. So I'm talking about, you might get their eyeball in focus, but their beak is out of focus, and the back of their head is out of focus. That's, in my mind, just too shallow. That's too shallow. So what most people recommend is shooting at f8, is setting your aperture to f8 or f11. You're in this puts you in kind of a rough position, especially if you're out in the woods. You're going to be in low light. You might need to consider using a flash. So you can see it's already getting very complicated. And we're just talking about songbirds. Now, as a beginner, I don't recommend that you go out in the woods and walk around and sit and wait and so forth. What I recommend is that you let the birds come to you. So the second bullet point I have here is songbirds with a blind. Okay, this is a scenario where you have a blind set up or a hide, and the birds are coming to you. Okay, maybe you've set out some bird seed for them, but the point is the birds are landing kind of where you expect them to land. Now in this scenario, this is a great scenario because you don't have to have a super telephoto. You honestly and truly do not. As a matter of fact, when I started shooting songbird photography, I had a 70 to 210, just an inexpensive Canon 70 to 210, and I was able to capture in my mind, some good shots because I was in a blind. The birds couldn't see me, and I would just sit back and I would sit there with a cable release and just fire away whenever a bird landed on the perch. So definitely with the songbirds, your lens selection can vary a lot. Say if you don't have a lot of money, you can just buy a 200 millimeter lens or a 300 millimeter lens and be done with it. Now there are advantages, even in that scenario, there are advantages to having a longer lens. Let's say, for example, I have a very skittish bird. I have a bird, something like maybe a northern cardinal, who are notoriously afraid of people. In that scenario, a 600 millimeter might be a nice thing to have because you can put a little distance between you and the bird. They can feel more comfortable. They can act more natural, and you're probably going to you may get better shots. I'm not going to guarantee that, but you may get better shots. So that's why I say anything from 200 to 600 for the songbirds and a blind. Okay, bullet point 4, wading birds. Love wading birds. I absolutely love to photograph wading birds. Okay, wild wading birds. Wild wading birds are very, very tricky. Now, when I say wild, I mean that these birds have not seen very many humans, okay? In this scenario, it's very unlikely that you're just going to walk up to them and photograph them, okay? Again, I'm going to recommend in this case a 600 to 800 millimeter lens because you're going to have to find a way to walk carefully up to them and photograph them, and that's not easy. Wild great blue herons are extremely difficult to photograph. Truly wild great blue herons that have never really had any human contact are very difficult to photograph. Now, what I like to do is I like to go to places that have wading birds that are more familiar with people. They're still wild, but they're more familiar with people. Now, in this scenario, you can get away with, if they're wild but used to people, I can get away with a 200 millimeter to a 600 millimeter. So I could bring my 70 to 200, and I could still get some great shots. Okay, but even in this scenario, if I wanted to get very tight portraits, depending on the bird species, depending on where they've landed and so forth, it's still nice to have a long lens. There are places that you don't need a long lens at. Gatorland, St. Augustine, Alligator Farm, 2 places that you can go and actually photograph birds with a 200 millimeter lens, and in some cases get tight portraits. So I think you can kind of see a pattern developing here with the birds. There's in the blind bird photography, and then there's outside the blind bird photography. And both have unique challenges or unique parameters for lens selection. So, why would I, here's an interesting sidebar. Why would I just go with a 200 millimeter if I had a 600 millimeter in my bag? Well, There are a couple of reasons, actually. One is that it's much, much lighter than a 600 millimeter lens. So if you're in a scenario where you have a lot of tame birds, like gatorland, for example, you're not going to get physically tired by carrying around a 200 millimeter. It's going to give you a lot of flexibility. So flexibility is an important concept to understand in lens selection. And it's not always about having a long lens. Sometimes you have to have a long lens. But if you don't have to have a long lens, don't use it. Don't use it just because you want to look cool and have your 600 millimeter lens out. I mean, you can get some phenomenal photographs with a 200 millimeter, and you're even going to, in some cases, pick up a little depth of field because you get more of that bird in focus because you're not, you're not right on top of them with a 600 millimeter lens. Okay, what's another scenario? Squirrels and rabbits. Okay, common wildlife found in your backyard, at the park and so on. Well, squirrels can get pretty small. It depends on, what you're looking to do with it. If you want a tight head and shoulders portrait of a squirrel, and it's relatively, I guess, untamed, you're probably going to need a 600 millimeter. But if you're in a very, if you're at Washington, D.C., for example, in one of the parks, those squirrels come right up to you. So you could use a 200 millimeter lens and get a tight head and shoulders portrait of the squirrel. So again, you're seeing this constant pattern of, is the bird tame or isn't it tame? Is the squirrel a tame squirrel? Isn't it tame? So these are all the questions and decisions that you have to make when you're going to plan your trip somewhere. Honestly, most of the time you could probably shoot a squirrel at around 400 millimeters, 500 millimeters, but they're pretty small. Pretty small. Rabbits, you're getting a little bigger. You could definitely use a 400 millimeter lens. You could use a 600. You might even be able to get away with a 200, depending on how familiar that the animal is with you. So, relatively easy subjects. Interestingly enough, I've taken very little squirrel photographs, even though I have squirrels everywhere around my house. I very rarely will photograph them, and that's strange to me. I don't know why I don't do that. I don't know. I consider them maybe a little passé or something. I don't know. But it's a good subject. Okay, now let's move on to big game. Okay, elk, white-tailed deer, black bear. If I'm going to go wild again, no blind, you got to have a big lens. You're going to be in 400 to 800 millimeter territory range. Probably mostly around 400. Depends, again, what are you looking for? Are you looking for environmental shots where you want to get an elk maybe on the top of a ridge and show his environment in the background of the mountain and the blue sky? If you're going to do that, then a 400, a 300, maybe even a 200 would work for you. But if you're wanting those tight images, you got to have a long lens. That's just the way the game is. And it took me a while to realize this as a wildlife photographer. I kept thinking, I just need a 300 millimeter. I just need a 400 millimeter. But when I bought my first 600, it was like a big light bulb just appeared over my head. I knew then that that's what I wanted. I knew that was the look that I had been going for years and was not getting it. So again, I'm going to put a plug in here for Sigma. I really love their lenses, and I love the 150 to 600. You've got every lens imaginable in the telephoto range up through 600 millimeters. It's hard to beat that when you're in the field. The only downside to that lens is it's an f5 to 6.3 lens. So you're going to have to bump up that ISO more often. Elk, big game. You're in a blind, you're in your car. You can definitely get away with a smaller lens here. Like I said, 200 millimeters maybe. If you want tight portraits, 600, 400 millimeter, all very doable. How about raptors? How about raptors in the wild? Very, very tricky. Very, very tricky. Wild raptors who are not used to people are very difficult to photograph. This is one of the reasons that many professionals will actually travel to unique locations to get the shot, because they would rather spend a few $1,000s or more than that to go to Alaska and photograph eagles than try to spend day after day after day trying to track down 2 or 3 bald eagles in their area. It's much easier, and you are able to get much better shots, more shots in a short period of time, and that's why you oftentimes don't see quote professionals shooting in their local areas, because it takes too much time. Time is precious when you're a professional. You're trying to figure out all your costs and so on. Well, if you're in the field too much, then you're not selling your images, and it's all a big trade-off for professionals. That's why I say it's not always a good idea to compare yourself to a professional, because professionals have unique needs. Professionals require, as a professional, you're required to make money to live. They'll do things that you and I would never do. Now, I consider myself a semi-professional in that I do make money with my images, but it's not my full-time job. And so I don't always have the need to go to, say, Homer, Alaska. I have a bald eagle, 5 minutes down the road, actually. I can go down there and wait him out, and I can photograph him. Now, the problem with raptors in the wild is you got to have a long lens. You got to be aware of regulations about getting too close, and you're going to have limited opportunity. And that's the biggest situation there. So lens selection, 600 to 800, and probably even a 2x teleconverter at times. So, that's just the way it is, unfortunately. Raptors in the wild, but raptors that are used to people. This is my last category that I have. This is a great category, because this is the one where I just was talking about, like we're in Homer, Alaska, or I can't think of any other places right now, but there's several places where you can go photograph raptors in the wild, but in a situation where they're not really fearful of humans. Now, in that case, I've heard stories of people shooting as, a 200 millimeter lens, and in some cases less. I think it was Homer, Alaska, where someone was talking about how they took a wide angle lens with them because the eagles were actually that close, and they were flying right in on them, and they were shooting with a 35 millimeter lens. Yeah, again, lens selection. It depends. It depends. And you know what it really depends on? It really depends on experience. As you continue to develop your lens arsenal and your experience increases, you start to realize that, oh man, this 600 was not enough lens. And you actually start realizing that you need teleconverters. And there may be times where you need to rent, an 800 millimeter lens, for example. You're probably not going to buy one because they're ridiculously expensive. And they're even expensive to rent too. That's the other situation. So that's kind of the skinny, I guess, on lens selection. I just wanted to say that before we move on to something else, I just want to say that don't stress out if you can't afford a 600 millimeter lens. I was a photographer for I'm not sure how many years it was. Probably, I don't know, 15 years before I bought a 600 millimeter lens. Don't be discouraged if you're sitting there and you're looking at your wallet and you're going, I don't have $10,000. because most people don't have $10,000. And if the truth be told, many of these photographers probably couldn't afford it and put it on a credit card, and they're probably still paying on it right now as you're listening to this. So please, take it easy and you'll get there. You'll get the money up eventually and you can buy that lens. Again, that's why I recommend, like, the Tamron is a good one. The Tamron 150 to 600 is a good lens. The Sigma 150 to 600 is a good lens. So, don't get all worried about it. Anyway, let's move on to the Know Your Subject segment. Okay, welcome to the Know Your Subject segment of the podcast. And as you know, this segment takes a look at an animal and discusses how the animal behaves and how we can take that information and make ourselves better photographers. The sound you just heard was that of the American black bear. According to the National Geographic, black bears are North America's most familiar and common bears. They typically live in forests and are excellent tree climbers, but are also found in mountains and swamps. Black bears are very opportunistic feeders. Most of their diet consists of grasses, roots, berries, and insects. They'll also eat fish and mammals. The average lifespan of a bear is 20 years. They can grow from 5 to 6 feet in length, and they can weigh anywhere from 200 to 600 pounds. I have to be honest with you, I have not done a lot of bear photography. This is something that's on my bucket list. It is an important thing to me, but it's something that I have not done a lot of. And so I'm not an expert by any means. I'm not afraid to admit that. I will tell you that I have some experience with them in the wild just from growing up in an area that was heavily bear populated. And I'll tell you this, you very rarely will see them. They're very quiet and they are very cautious. They do primarily come out at night to feed, which is one of the reasons you don't see them as often. They do tend to get into a lot of things. They like berries. They like various grubs and so forth. They dig up out of the ground, and they'll eat just about anything, including your garbage if you leave it out at night. They're an interesting creature. They're very large. People are oftentimes very frightened by them, and you should respect them. They're certainly an animal that can do a lot of damage and kill you if they want to, but that's not normally their goal. Their goal is to just eat and sleep and have cubs. That's pretty much what they do. There have been stories of them in situations where they have attacked people. They have attacked people en masse, or attacked a mass of people, I should say. Very, very rare. Extremely rare. Do I carry bear spray with me when I go in the woods? Absolutely. Am I probably ever going to use it? Probably not. But my grandfather was a woodsman, and he grew up in the woods. And when I say he grew up in the woods, I mean he was like the only one there, pretty much. There was a few houses there, but not very many. And he grew up with snakes and bears and deer. The man never, to my knowledge, he would never go into the woods without being armed in some way. And that wasn't because he was going to shoot anything, but he wanted to be prepared. And so I believe in being prepared as well. And I've heard people that I respect greatly say they never carry bear mace or any kind of gun into the woods. That's perfectly fine. That's their prerogative. It's their life. You know, chances are nothing's going to happen to them. But I like to be prepared. I think it's smart. And hey, just because you're carrying a gun or carrying bear spray, that doesn't mean you're going to win. You know, it just gives you a little better odds. But I don't want you to be afraid of that. I don't want you to be afraid of that because, like I said, I roamed the woods as a child. I roamed the woods up into my teens, and I'll tell you what, I've seen bear while I was out walking 2 times. One time was when I was very young, and I was walking up in the woods with my cousin, and we saw a cub. Another time, I was walking along a lake shore with my cousin, and we looked up, and there was a bear eating berries about 50 yards away from us, 75 yards away from us. So, like I said, they're skittish. They don't like people. They're not interested in hanging out with you. Now, there are a few places that you can go. One place that I'll mention, which is a very good place to photograph black bears, is in the Great Smoky Mountains. In the Great Smoky Mountains, specifically in Cades Cove, Tennessee. It is not uncommon at all to see bear there. The bear are acclimated to people, and they can be seen hanging from trees. During the day, they'll sleep up in the trees. They can be seen out in early morning, walking, through the meadows and woods, and it's a good place to photograph them. It really is. There's other places. I can't think of the name of it here in North Carolina. On the coast, we have a national park that is known for black bears. The east coast of America is heavily populated with black bears. And actually, here in my home, only a few miles away, there was a couple yearlings walking right through town. So, they're definitely out there. How do you photograph them? You need to do some research on that. Okay. Like I said, I would just, if I were going to go out right now and look to photograph bear, I would not go out into the woods and try to just find them. I would probably go to somewhere where they have a heavy population and are used to people. But that's not to say you can't go out in the woods. I mean, you can. But that's a lot of hard work. A lot of hard work. And when they're most active is when your camera is going to do absolutely no good, and that's nighttime. That's pretty much all I had for today. Again, if you have questions, comments, please feel free to email me at matt.cuda@mattcuda.com or tweet me at @mattcuda. I mean, that's one of the reasons that we're here. I shouldn't say we. I am here doing this podcast. Some of the things I'd like to see in the future here, I don't know if I'm going to have time to do it. I'd really like to have some interviews, not so much with photographers, but I would like to have interviews with people that are in the know, maybe people from the National Park Service, people from the Audubon Society, places like that where we can learn more about the subjects that we're photographing. Because again, that's where I think it's at. I mean, you can learn how to use your camera, that's fine. But if you don't know how to find the animals and know their behavior and so forth, you're going to be out there photographing with one hand tied behind your back, basically. And that's not a good situation to be in. So anyway, thanks for listening. Make it a great day and get out there and enjoy nature. Bye-bye. Music for this episode was provided by Dr. Turtle.